Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this time together. And for our opening prayers today, there are some images and words, and you may want to focus your attention on the screen, or you may just prefer to listen to the words. So I invite you now to take just a few moments to consciously become aware of the present moment. To find a comfortable position in your seat where you are. Noticing perhaps any physical sensations, perhaps any areas of tension, and letting those go. And then noticing any sounds that you hear around you, in the room or further away. And letting those go. And then just becoming aware of your breathing, focusing on your inward and outward breath. And so we begin our reflections. To be present is to arrive as one is and open up to the other. At this instant, as I arrive here, God is present, waiting for me. God always arrives before me, desiring connection with me, even more than my most intimate friend. I take a moment to greet my loving God. In the presence of my loving Creator, I look back at my feelings over this last day, the highs, the lows, and the level ground. Where has the Lord been present? Turning my attention to this moment, I think of the image of the potter and clay. Then the word of the Lord came to me, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter does, declares the Lord? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, you are the potter. We are all the work of your hand. How do these words and this image speak to me today? How might they be speaking to this gathering? What are my hopes for today's gathering? Do I have any concerns? As I share my response to the image of the potter, I can be sure that God is present in this moment and among all who are gathered here this evening. God of love, as we begin this time of listening and sharing together, we ask for the grace to open our hearts and minds to your spirit and a willingness to be shaped like the clay in your hands through Jesus Christ, our Lord and Saviour. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Alison. If you're not on gallery view, can I invite you at this point to put yourself on gallery view? You may end up seeing just a small fraction of the number of participants that we have tonight, but as we continue to have this sense of welcome together, I want to just point out, if you're on the first page of the gallery, you should be able to see myself and Julie Dunston, Alison McTier, Christopher Chapman, and John Francis Friendship. We are 4 of the 6 who've been the key initiating group over the last 18 months or so, working towards this emerging spiritual direction forum for the UK. And we're delighted to be with you, but we'd like to invite you to greet each other and acknowledge each other's welcome presence. So do give a wave to those that you can see and perhaps those you can't see, as we recognize this extraordinary gathering of people involved in the Ministry of Spiritual Direction across the country. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now because I want to just tell you a little bit more about the plan for this evening. So this evening is entitled The Shaping the Emerging Forum, and our aim in this time is that we will involve everyone here to be part of this process of shaping how the forum develops. We want, as we do this, to tell something of the story of what has got us to this point so far, share the sense of the vision that has emerged from all the consultation work and discernment work that we did last year, and particularly the areas for development that we are wanting to focus on tonight. We want to involve all of you in reflecting on these areas in small groups, so you'll have a chance to talk to one another, to listen and to hear, as well as to give your voice to the contribution. And then to give us your contributions through a feedback form that we will be sending the link to later on this evening to you all, so that what you find yourself sharing in small groups you can report back, and we will have a collection, a gathering of all the wisdom and all the thinking and the ideas that you have shared. So that's the program for tonight. You will have had an email from me today with not only the details of getting in, but also once more the forum's vision. And that vision statement is very much at the heart of where we are at the moment and where we're seeking to go. This sense of the forum being a forum that is both supporting and resourcing of spiritual directors, promoting and protecting good practice, advocating and encouraging creative development of this ministry within the church and in our changing world. That vision statement has, as part of it, too, a set of values, ways in which we believe God has been calling us and showing us that we go about what we do as we work together in this forum. I'm not going to read through the whole list, it's quite a long list, but you've had a chance to have a look at it more than once, I suspect. But this sense of it being somewhere where we value everyone and we seek to be attentive, listening, gracious, as well as offering something of ourselves. In that, it's all about the nature of the practice of spiritual accompaniment, of spiritual direction, seeking to live as we work together in that spirit that we seek to offer to others when we accompany them. What we're going to dig most into this evening is the last part, really, of the vision statement, which is the how do we go about achieving that vision, and that sense of what we're needing to do is to create a core committee, but also have 3 working groups, and we want to look particularly this evening at those working groups. The first one to support and resource spiritual directors, the second to promote and protect good practice, the third to advocate and encourage the creative development of this ministry within the church and our world. And we'll be having more time with all of those later on. But that's the broad outline of what we're aiming to do this evening, and we will be done and dusted by 8 o'clock. And allow at least me to get myself to have some tea, if not you all too. But to begin with now, as we get into that agenda, Chris is going to tell us something of the story of how this has all come about. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. And very briefly, but in the autumn of 2019, those of us with our hands up began to talk about what might help spiritual direction, resource, develop, safeguard, spiritual accompaniment, and those involved with it. And the idea of a national forum began to emerge from those discussions. And very much as Nick has said, that's sort of understanding that if we're beginning to explore the idea of a forum, we need to practice what spiritual accompaniment is all about, that listening, discernment, making room for God. So as much as talking, I think we were trying to pray, we were trying to listen. And one of the things we felt it was important to do was to contact as many people as we could who were involved in holding spiritual direction networks or in training, and to ask their views about what a forum might be for, the sorts of values by which it might operate, and how we, in concrete terms, go about that task. I just read out something that was sent out at that time when we were making those contacts with people. We see the potential for such a forum to be a common table and a centre of gravity for thinking together and encouraging good practice in spiritual direction. This common table provides the place where we can gather, relate, and share matters of mutual interest. A centre of gravity holds things in relationship, and in a forum, our common concern for spiritual direction provides this. In so doing, it allows for individuality in finding our places around it. Thus, the forum would be a space for communication and discernment rather than oversight or control. I think that was very much what had come out of our prayer. And we sent out, I think, around 260 surveys, but 170 back, asking people what they thought about the idea of a forum, what it should be for, what their hopes were there any concerns, and 170 replies, 72 pages of comments. So we read through and prayed through all the comments that came in. 95% of people supported the idea of a forum. And in working through what people had shared and said, we came to that vision that Nick has just shared, the values that people felt were important, the beginning of a sense of how to go about this task. We've shared that vision, and in January, earlier this year, we had an opportunity for people to give their views about that emerging picture. And think about, we had about 120 people came to that event. So this sense of a story, a process that has had at its heart looking to be open to the work of the potter, and not to take that too much on ourselves, to listen, involve one another in a spirit of cooperation and openness to God. So I hope that just gives a sense of where we've got to here, how we've got to here.
Thank you very much, Chris. I've just found a message on the chat saying, can I give some idea of the timescales for this evening? And the timescale is that roughly we will be spending the next half an hour with 3 pairs of conversations between members of the group around the 3 aspects of development for the forum. And then there will be a little bit of time for reflection, and at about 7:05 or so, there will be we'll be breaking up into small groups and have about 25 minutes in small groups, and then we will come back for a plenary for roughly the last half hour before finishing at 8 o'clock. So we're going to move now into these pairs of conversations. The one person who's been a key member of our initiating group over the last 18 months is Ruth Holgate, who unfortunately, because of other commitments, is unable to be with us tonight. Originally, she and I were going to be in conversation in the first of these 3 conversations. In her place, Vron Smith is going to take the form of a sort of interviewer of me, because Vron hasn't been part of the initial conversations, but she's very much here tonight. I can't see you on my screen, Vron, but if you could raise your hand, that would help, and we could kind of find
I am,
you.
I am here, Nick, don't worry.
I see you now. Great to see you, Vron.
Don't panic.
And at this stage, I think the members of the group who've got their hands raised can unraise their hands, or whatever the term is on the screen. And Vron and I, we've got a few minutes to talk on the first aspect of this mission of the forum to support and resource spiritual directors. So Vron, I'm in your hands.
Very, very dangerous, Nick, very dangerous.
Yep.
So, I mean, I think firstly, obviously support and resource spiritual directors, but perhaps expand on that, the purpose of that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which surely it says what it does on the tin, or does what it says on the tin. But I think the sense is that to create opportunities for both spiritual directors and spiritual directors networks to find a greater support for each other in this ministry. So that sense of support, mutual support, is key, I think, and very much part of what motivated me to be seeking this. But also that sense that as networks and individuals, we may have all sorts of resources that are valuable and helpful to this ministry. How do we share them is kind of one of the questions that's worth asking, I find. And so the forum, it seems, can provide a way in which we can more easily share some of the resources that may be held individually or in networks, or even nationally. I mean, at the moment, the Retreat Association has the guidelines for spiritual direction available on its website, but that's kind of one of the places that maybe sits within the sense of resourcing that we are seeking.
So, I mean, you're kind of mentioning resourcing, and I'm guessing that implies if we're sharing them, then there's needs around, that we have a variety of needs. So I'm just wondering, what are you seeing as some of those needs?
Well, it's been striking as people fed back about the whole idea of the forum to hear that sense that people had of the value of having connection, of having a conversation with other people who are involved in this ministry. Some of those conversations happen in networks and so on, but the sense of, certainly over lockdown particularly, every gathering of people involved in spiritual direction has kind of been resounding with this sense of, isn't it great to be able to talk with each other? And you know, the gift of Zoom in all of that has been part of it. But that sense that somehow we've missed something, and seeing the possibility now, I think, is very strong. I think, you know, spiritual direction is by its nature quite isolated. We do what we do in a room with one other generally, and we leave that and we're on our own again. And so this sense of the valuing of connection, I think, is something that has emerged. Yes, the regions provide some networking for people, but I've picked up quite a lot that there are a number who are outside of that. I mean, I'm just spotting on the chat, Alison saying, "Are you in Scotland? We'd love to have a conversation." And that sense of the value of connecting. For some people, you know, access to networks is quite hard, and before Zoom, it was probably even harder for many. I mean, Zoom doesn't take away some of the problems, but the sense that we can and do need some bigger conversations, I think, is there. And I think the other dimension to this is the national scene, really. There are things that are really good for spiritual directors to have a big conversation around. I mean, just over a year ago, we had the terrible news coming in of Jean Vanier, and how some of his directees had been abused by him. And how do we have a proper conversation in the world of spiritual direction in this country around the issues that that raises? How do we handle safeguarding? And how do we find a collective voice that can speak into that sort of controversy and saying, well, this is what we seek to do, and these are the safeguards we seek to work with? There was kind of an ignorance of that in some of the conversation on that debate, which I was saddened by. These are all parts of where I see some need, I think, that is there.
Yeah. So some critical conversations and support, and that we need to be able to have. So, I mean, I guess the next question is, well, how might this happen?
Well, yeah, and we're seeing it in action, I think. You know, the fact that we can gather a large number of spiritual directors together, that common interest, I think, you know, the Zoom provides a forum for doing this in a way that we perhaps 18 months ago hadn't even thought of as a potential for this forum idea that we were playing with at that point. But that's not to say we're dismissing the possibility of real physical gatherings at conferences or forums in a place where we're all in the same room together. That would be wonderful too. So we envisage that. But both those methods can give that sense of conversation, of support, of the mutual discernment that is part of this process that we're in, I think. But I think also, you know, again, the internet is providing us with an incredibly powerful way of sharing resources. We can get emails out to everyone, you know, with relatively little effort. In fact, I speak from experience, having sent most of the emails that have gone out to the forum over the last year or so. But then, of course, there's also social media and web pages, and I see what the web pages providing us with an opportunity to put lists of resources, links to groups, you know, just the place for people to come to find something that might be helpful for them.
So kind of the finding something that's helpful. I mean, where are those resources going to come from that we're going to be sharing? I mean, that's the good question.
Yeah, I look at that and think, whoa, are we set a big agenda for ourselves? But I think some of those resources are already there. It's not that we're going to reinvent the wheel in all of this. I think it's more to some degree collecting the wisdom that is where some of those resources already lie and are available, but perhaps not as visible or not as commonly known about as a forum could do that. You know, the Retreat Association guidelines I've already mentioned would be one resource present, but there are many resources held in the local networks across the country which we might be able to kind of point to as well and be offered wider. But I think there's also the need for more resources to be generated. And that's part of what we envisage some of these working groups doing, is beavering away to produce some helpful resources or find resources and add them to the list. So there's a potential for quite a lot of work here, I think.
Okay. So in true accompaniment form, I'm aware we're coming up to time. So in a nutshell then, what are you hoping for?
Well, Chris earlier used that sense of the common table and that mutuality that is both open to or seeks to be supportive, offer valuable resources, inspiring better practice in us all, I think is a huge thing, actually, and very exciting to me at this point. But the other thing I'm really hoping for is more people involved in enabling all this resourcing and the communication and supporting, because we're only a small group at the moment. It needs to be bigger in terms of active engagement. So something about more people to share in that process.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you, Vron. Great questions. So that first element to do with support and resource. The second element that we're going to move on to now is the promoting and protecting of good practice. And in this, John Francis and Alison McTier, John Francis Friendship and Alison McTier are going to be sharing. Over to you two.
Thanks, Nick. I'm from the London Centre for Spiritual Direction, Alison from the Retreat Association. So we're going to have a conversation much as Vron and Nick did. So Alison, I wonder if I can first ask you, what examples do you find that there are of good practice in spiritual direction?
Well, I suppose coming from the Retreat Association, I'm bound to give reference to the guidelines. Nick's already touched on them, and obviously they're only one part of the greater whole, but they were put together in a very collaborative way, which I think is also very much underpinning the way that this forum has drawn together, and were in response to a training consultation for those who train spiritual directors, and took place over 3 years to draw them together. And so I feel that's been something that perhaps we can build on. I mean, for example, at the London Centre, you have some guidelines as well, I believe. And what kind of model do they follow?
Yeah, we do have guidelines. The reason we put them together was very much to a sensed need or a felt need that was gradually growing, that we need to be able to offer some principles to people, not rules, but principles that those who associate themselves with the centre particularly might be aided by in their ministry. I'd previously been with, I didn't really is here from Chelmsford, but I used to be part of the Chelmsford Diocesan core group or area core group, and we created a similar. I imagine a lot of places have something similar, but probably we're all slightly different as well.
Yes, and I think that's the beauty of having sort of guidelines that can be amended or adapted to region, but we're all essentially coming from the same place. We're all wanting to share good practice and kind of update that according to events and needs.
Absolutely, but in all of that, of course, I might not know what insights you have, and I might be aided by those insights if I knew what they were, and similarly the other way around. Mm-hmm. So my sense has always been that a forum is an ideal place, and probably the only place where that kind of conversation can happen. And why reinvent the wheel if Area X has done a lot of work, let's say, on safeguarding?
Yes, I agree.
Why do it all over again and possibly come up with something slightly different and missing something? So my sense has always been that one of the reasons for the forum is to come up with these examples of good practice that we can share with one another and learn from each other as well, and see where maybe we've missed something.
Yes, I agree. I think this is living guidelines that are going to be changed all the time, and that we need to make everybody aware of as much as possible. And the forum is a very good platform for doing that. Absolutely.
I mean, I like the term guidelines. I think that's sufficiently kind of flexible, so it's not a rule, but yeah.
Absolutely.
Promoting good guidelines.
So I wondered, John, if you think there are what your views would be on areas that perhaps we could look into, some areas of good practice that have not been covered so much, in which there might be a need to have some kind of guidelines.
Yes, well, I mean, I think particularly that area of safeguarding. I know a number of regions have developed and are offering some sort of training in safeguarding, but I know For example, when we started looking at this from the London Centre, people were saying, oh, of course, my area has safeguarding for clergy. And that's very true, but I went through all of that. And I know that spiritual directors have a very specific need to understand what safeguarding means in the terms of the ministry. We're not running Sunday schools. Well, probably anyhow. So what are our particular needs, for example, that safeguarding needs to cover and acknowledge? That sort of thing is really, really important. Similarly, in the area of supervision, I know there are very mixed views on the need for supervision or the purpose of supervision or what actually it is. So just having conversations about what do we mean by, understand by, where can we find it, and who maybe can we encourage to develop that particular ministry of supervision.
Absolutely. And I also wondered about the whole practice of working on Zoom and on screen, which of course a couple of years ago there probably wouldn't have been the need for it, but now it's just so overwhelming, and it seems to me that it is changing the dimension of how we practice spiritual direction, and is an area that people are very happy to have guidelines or to have, you know, discussion about, and that might be very pertinent at the moment.
I think that business about a place of discussion is really quite important, because as Nick said originally, this is a very, I'm not going to say lonely ministry, but one that's often in solitary places. You might be fortunate to belong to an area group that gathers from time to time, but that area might be very scattered, and you might not be able to meet very often, if at all. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, I think Nick has also highlighted the value of gathering for people who are working in more isolation.
Yeah, so that really sort of leads me on to wondering, how could this forum help then, do you think, Alison?
Well, I think we can continue to invite discussion and development in the way that we've already started to do by holding this event and the previous one, and to find a way of articulating a shared understanding of good practice, so that it really does support the people that are part of this forum, and offers a way to pass on information and good practice as easily as possible.
And presumably to be a place where ideas, suggestions, questions could be processed.
Yes, absolutely.
And received.
Yes. Yes, I think it could be a very lively process, but one that I think everybody would hopefully find great value in.
I'm sure. I must say, I was very surprised when I first started looking at this matter of the possibility of a national forum, that Ireland has a national forum, but Britain doesn't. America has one, but Britain, we're always a bit behind, it seems.
So it'd be really good to make up for that a bit and find a way forward. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear people's suggestions and ideas, both this evening and following, just to see where people are coming from in this, because I think we really need to hear what everybody is thinking and how they're responding.
I'm sure a lot of people are already buzzing with some questions and thoughts. So let's pass on to the next pair. Do you have anything else that you wanted to say, Alison?
No, I think that's. I think we've covered the areas now. Thank you.
Okay, so Nick, we'll pass on to the next pair. So there's not too much champing at the bit, and we can eventually move on to that general sharing.
Thanks very much, John Francis and Alison. Next, it's Christopher and Julie about the advocating and encouraging creative development of this ministry. So over to you two.
Thank you and good evening. It's really exciting and wonderful to be together and to be part of this emerging forum. So to advocate and encourage the creative development of this ministry within the church and in the world, those are big, big topics and really suggest so many ways forward, and we'll be very interested to hear what you think on this. And for now, a few thoughts from me and then Christopher. Chris, when we chatted the other day about this, I said something that you thought might be a helpful start. I imagined that our task in this area was like a triangle with 2 points outward and 1 point facing inward. Reaching out on the one hand to the church itself, finding our voice, advocating and promoting spiritual direction and its gift within the wider church. Reaching out on the other hand to a changing world so much in need of fresh, accessible and creative expressions of spiritual direction. But the third point I saw as in reach, and that may seem a strange thing to include at this point, but I think, and we agreed, that the way we think about ourselves is crucial to how well we can reach out. How we advocate and encourage spiritual direction amongst ourselves will influence how we promote it out there. To reach out well, I think we need to be healthy and grounded and strong in our identity, in our charism, knowing what we are and what we are not. I think that means being not merely relevant, which is always seductive, that is, being merely relevant, but not being merely relevant, but radical, which is to say deeply rooted. I think it means not being just merely professional, but prophetic, which is to say, I guess, having fire in our belly for what God wants to say and do in the world. We need to see ourselves as both prophetic ministry and pioneering mission, if you will. There's a lot to unpack there, but I wanted to get that concept of in reach in here as part of the discussion about how we encourage ministry in the church and in the world. Because I think there's a desperate need of a robust and searching spirituality, one that reaches into the church and into the world with prophetic imagination and draws deeply from the wisdom of the tradition. So I'd love to think about how we could encourage that as part of this aspect of our vision. And Chris, going on from there, how do you see that reaching out? Where do we begin?
It's really helpful, Julie, that you've begun with that radical openness to God and to a tradition, and actually knowing where we come from. As maybe we begin to reach out with a more collected voice. I guess that's the idea of a forum, that we have the possibility to be able together to speak in the first instance, perhaps to the church. And we've already said something there about, for example, National Retreat, the Retreat Association guidelines, and Nick mentioned about the whole Jean Vanier scene, and the need there to have a clear voice about what's the vision, what's the values, and what's the value of spiritual direction. So there's something around that. And one of the things I'm conscious of, and certainly came up through the survey, was that many local spiritual direction networks feel under pressure, feel under-resourced. And I wonder if there's something that a forum can offer in that collected voice about underlining the not just the value of spiritual direction, but also its particular values and how important those are for the healthy functioning of the life of the church. I think one thing we were very conscious of was not wanting to undermine, undercut, try and take the place of what was happening locally and regionally, but looking at where collectively, perhaps we could have a clearer voice. I mean, another thing I'm aware of is we're in a very strange time of being church at the moment, and very important decisions and discernment hopefully going on about where we go forward as church. And it seems to me that the spiritual direction community has a lot to share, a lot to give to that, because our practice is around discernment, listening, prayer, dialogue, you know, in the spirit of dialogue. And maybe we've got something to offer to the wider church with those skills and practices. An example of that in Roman Catholic Church, there's just the little sneaking idea of synodical working and local synods to begin to touch into local views about where the church is and where the church might be going and responding to the needs of the world. Maybe the spiritual direction community has something to offer to a process like that. How do we discern? How do we listen? How do we make decisions? And as spiritual directors, my sense is often we're rather shy and reticent. And maybe it's a time to be more generous, even more assertive in offering what we have. That's maybe looking at the church. But one of the things that I'm also very aware of, and we've already talked about, is so much is happening in our world, and lockdowns kind of highlighted that. And actually how much spiritual hunger there seems to have been in people who don't go to church necessarily, aren't connected with formal religious frameworks, but looking to have a place to talk about their experience. Is God real? And if so, then what might I do about that? I just wonder, Julie, do you have any reflections on that and the relevance of spiritual direction to that hunger?
Yes, thanks, Chris. It clearly is a very ripe time for promoting spiritual direction in the world, isn't it? People are searching deeply and they're asking really big questions. When I think about promoting spiritual direction in the world, I think of process and content. For process, I ask myself, and then you, how might we do spiritual direction in different ways to reach more people? Online, that's really opened up, hasn't it? In groups, could we do more of that? On the bus, what would it mean to actually begin to imagine spiritual direction as something more than just that very particular conversation one-to-one for an hour behind closed doors? I think we really need to think about this, because we need to get out there with what we have. But I think of content as well, and I think that we need to try to communicate, when we're promoting spiritual direction, the depth and breadth of the spiritual conversation. People searching these days know that it can't be just about a private feel-good spirituality, but must be address the bigger picture. I think we have to offer people the sort of spiritual direction that takes questions like practice and lifestyle very seriously. We need to link up the inner and the outer far more than we do now. It has to be able, spiritual direction, to stand up to the big questions, social injustices and ecological disaster and polarized politics. Something that's become more and more apparent in my own spiritual direction and in my accompaniment of others is that we must do the work. We can't just talk about it anymore. We must do the work. I think that means finding practices and helping people to find practices that nourish our inner life, open our eyes to both the beauty and the pain of the world, and to develop the sort of practices that will compel us to want to change the way we live. So I hope that made sense, that the process is important, but also the content of what we're promoting in the world. So going back to where I began, we need to promote amongst ourselves and then offer to the world nothing less than the radical and prophetic vision of Christ, really. Oh, any final thoughts from you, Chris, on that?
Well, I was just thinking that perhaps in some ways what a forum does, it enables us to have that collective listening place and place of dialogue with what's happening in the world. And in the same sort of way that we do in individual spiritual accompaniment. You know, we're listening to someone. We're trying desperately to listen to the Spirit, and how am I called to respond to this person's need? And maybe, you know, responding to an individual's need, we go out of our comfort zone of what we normally offer because this person needs something else.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the forum might help us do that collectively as we meet these new challenges, new needs, this hunger. We also are challenged to get out of our comfort zone and respond creatively as we listen to the Spirit.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. It's a very rich area, as are all three of them. Nick, do you want me to move right into the reflection? So having heard some of that, we're going to invite you now just for a few moments of personal reflection on what you've heard before we move into our groups to share that. So I want to ask you as we begin, of the three aspects of our vision that each of us have addressed now in pairs, which one draws you most? Choose the aspect of our vision that you feel most drawn to tonight. You're not going to be bound to that. It'll just be what you focus on as part of the conversation tonight. What aspect of our vision are you most drawn to? Perhaps why? And why? And having chosen that, 3 questions. What would your top 1 or 2 priorities be for this group? We might all draw up a long list under each of these categories, but tonight we want to tease out quickly from you. What would your top 1 or 2 priorities be for this group that you've chosen? Just jot those down now. And you'll have time to fill this in a sort of brief break between now and the group. But the second question is, what would your main concern be? Your main concern or 2 for this group? What would be your main concern or 2 for this group? And what 1 or 2 suggestions would you offer this group? So 3 questions, deliberately asking you to try and make some priorities. What comes to you first? What comes to you most strongly? We're going to leave you with those questions as you stretch and maybe grab a drink and continue to think about these, after which Nick's going to propose a way for us to bring these responses to these questions into our small group discussion.
Thanks, Julie. So the clock tells me it's 7 o'clock on the dot now. If we take 10 minutes as a comfort stop at this point to stretch, ponder, may give you a little bit more time with those questions. And then at 7:10, we'll regather and I will introduce the group process and we'll go from there. Okay, see you in 10 minutes, folks.